Hello everyone, Mr. John here from Air Team Institute with this week's Thursday tidbit where we're going to be finishing up the idea of aggregating, combining reviews that we started last week in our video. So if you haven't watched last week's video, I would recommend you check it out. But let's start with a quick review of the two different approaches that we discussed. The first approach, when you're given the review, this is an approach roughly used by the website Metacritic. They convert the review into a 0 to 100 scale, so we make the review a numerical value, and then they publish the average of all those scores. So they turn the review into a number score, and they publish the average of those scores. Now, the other approach here, which is one done roughly by the website Rotten Tomatoes, they convert the review to fresh or rotten. So this is a binary scale. And they publish the percentage of reviews that are quote unquote fresh. Now, just a reminder for our purposes, today fresh is going to be greater than or equal to 6 or something there. So we're going to look at scores on a 1 to 10 scale, and in that case, greater than or equal to 6 or 60% we're going to be talking about as fresh today. So what were some of the things we were asked to look at and think about that we're going to talk about in this video? Well, we have 10 movie reviews. So we have them on a 1 to 10 scale. Remember, as I just mentioned, 6 and above is going to be fresh. We want to give some examples where these scores are very different. So one where the Metacritic score is much higher than the Rotten Tomatoes score. Can we do the reverse there as well? And along the way, we want to talk about some of the pros and cons of these methods for combining the reviews in that case. Now, let's look at a first example here where the Metacritic score is going to end up higher than the Rotten Tomatoes score. Now, these answers can vary a lot. These aren't really practical answers because it might be hard to come up with a scenario where this exact thing would happen in real life. But remember, we're worried about the math a little bit, and then you can discuss and think about how it does apply to real life scenarios too. So this one is reviews of all 5 in this case. So this is what I mean by might not be something that happens all the time, where everybody agrees and everyone gives this movie a 5 out of 10. Now, for Metacritic, remember that the 5 is going to turn into 50, and then the average of all of these, well, all of them are exactly the same, and so then we are going to have a score here for Metacritic of 50. So the Metacritic score is 50 in this case. Now, let's compare how this works for the Rotten Tomatoes. Now you are starting to see probably where the number 5 comes in, because for Rotten Tomatoes, 5 is going to turn into a rotten score. So all of the movies will be considered rotten, all of the reviews, and so this will be a 0%. The Rotten Tomatoes score will be 0% in this scenario. Now, it's very, very similar, but let's look at our next example and then talk about these as well. Right, our next example is, well, what if we want Rotten Tomatoes to be much greater than Metacritic? Based on the previous slide, you can probably guess what's coming. Pause the video if you want to think about it a little bit more. Otherwise, what's going to happen here if all of the reviews are 6? Remember, this is our threshold here. So let's skip a little bit of the work here. 6 becomes 60 for Metacritic. They're all 60s, so the score here is going to be 60 as far as Metacritic is concerned. And for Rotten Tomatoes, 6 is our threshold for fresh. So all of these reviews are going to be considered fresh, and so we will have a 100% score there. So this really highlights when we have these edge cases. And of course, like I was mentioning, these things are not really distinguishing and aren't going to really be like this in real life. But it starts to see a little bit of the big differences between Rotten Tomatoes versus Metacritic. Of course, not everyone might give a 5, but if everyone gives like 3, 4, 5s, right? Everyone's saying, okay, the movie is somewhat decent, right? I wouldn't really recommend seeing it. It's not great, but it's not the worst movie I've ever seen. Metacritic will say, okay, the score is around 30, 40, something like that. Whereas Rotten Tomatoes, again, would be closer to 0 if they're really all below that fresh rating. And you could see something similar happening here. Maybe they're not all 6s, but 6, 7s, and 8s, right? Somebody's saying, nobody's saying this is the greatest movie ever, right? People are saying it's pretty good, not the best, but Rotten Tomatoes says it's all 100%. For example, then compare that to what if somebody gave it all 10s? Rotten Tomatoes wouldn't distinguish these 6s versus all of the 10s in that case as well. Now, you might say this is just kind of proof that Rotten Tomatoes isn't doing the right thing, right? But remember that these things could be, and in a lot of cases might be, more binary than Metacritic wants to consider. For example, what if you're just worried, do I want to see a movie? Is it going to be enjoyable? If all of these people who reviewed the movie a 6 enjoyed the movie, Rotten Tomatoes is doing a better job of capturing that than the Metacritic. And so let's compare that to one final example. Actually, the scores are going to be very, very similar for this one. But I think this is another interesting one to look at to discuss how these review aggregations work and maybe don't work in some cases. So let's look at this final example here of 5 1s and 5 10s. Of course, when we're doing the mathematics of this, these extreme cases are interesting to discuss, but let's see about what's happening here. So we have 1s and 10s on the two ends. So the average of 1 and 10 is 5.5. So we can pretty easily see that Metacritic is going to give this a 55 out of 100 on this scale. And it's also pretty easy to see that we have 5 1s, that's 5 rottens, 5 10s, 5 freshes. So Rotten Tomatoes is going to give this a 50% score as well. Now, what's interesting here is that this is a pretty middle of the road score, right? So middle of the road score. But what is interesting about this in this scenario, and is one interesting thing to continue thinking about here, notice that this Metacritic score is very, very similar to the first example of all 5s, right? So this is a middle of the road score, right? But no review thought the movie, right, was a okay review itself. So this is another interesting thing. If you're thinking, am I going to enjoy this movie? Well, Rotten Tomatoes kind of gave you a good idea. Half of the people enjoyed this movie, half of the people hated this movie, did not like this movie, right? Whereas the 55 on Metacritic, does that mean the movie was just okay? Was everybody giving it 5s and 6s? Nobody thought it was great. Nobody thought it was horrible, right? Well, that's actually not what happened here, right? This was a very, divisive movie. Some people really liked it, thought it was a great movie. Some people really disliked it, thought it was horrible. But that's not really captured with the average score in this case either. So it's an interesting thing to think about when we oftentimes do a lot of these things mathematically, but it's good to take a step back once in a while and see, okay, how do these numbers come up? Are we really applying them correctly? What is a the correct way to apply the numbers. And it really depends on the case. So it is something you have to think about and work with depending on the scenarios you have. So try to think a little bit more, right? If you're interested, and next time you see a movie, if you like that movie or dislike that movie, compare it to some of the scores, some of the reviews you might see online, and see what you think about these different ways of combining all of the reviews into one. That will be it for this video. Stay tuned for a new topic next week. If you have ideas for another topic, let us know in the comments below. If you like this video, please follow us, give us a subscription, right? Like the video, that really helps out. Otherwise, I will see everyone next time. Goodbye.